Well, here we are after a day and a half of enthralling debates about the unfinished legacy of Vatican II. And last but not least, we're going to talk about the vitality of Vatican II. Our final session opens with a keynote address from one of our most accomplished historians of the Council, Massimo Faggioli, whom I will introduce in more detail shortly. He will be addressing the topic, the vitality of Vatican II, directly. Following his talk, I will ask each of our panellists to come and join us and, in turn, first offer brief reflections in response to Massimo's lecture, and second, I want them to answer the following question, also in turn. Consider one of the key Vatican II documents that have occupied our deliberations since yesterday afternoon. Were that document being composed today, what would be the key difference in the outcome of the final text from the version produced in 1965? That's the first time our speakers have actually known about their task, so I wanted to give them just a little bit of notice. Now, to focus our attention on Vatican II's unfinished agenda, it's the afternoon, so we perhaps need a bit of stirring up. I want to share with you the closing words of a monumental study of the Council, simply entitled The Second Vatican Council, by the late, great German Catholic theologian Otto Hermann Pesch, a former Dominican who for many years taught in the Protestant Faculty of Theology at Germany's University of Hamburg. The final section of this book is simply entitled A Dream of the Church, and I quote Pesch's words. A line of prominent contemporaries, theologians and non-theologians, have in the last years publicly made known their dream of the Church. I am not prominent, he says, that was an understatement, but I also dream of the Church. I allow myself to dream once again this dream at the close of our narrative of the Council. I dream of a Church that says clearly that it exists for the sake of the gospel and the faith of humanity. I dream of a Church that neither in theory nor in practice believes it must help along the power of the gospel over hearts with measures. I dream of a Church that in its self-understanding and in its image holds together the best elements of the Catholic, Lutheran, Reformed and Orthodox understanding of church in fruitful tension. I dream of a Church that resists bureaucratization insofar as the practical necessities allow for that, and that deals with people in a different manner than the state apparatus tends to. I dream of a Church that in its communal life credibly holds up to modern society and its supposed practical constraints, the counterpart of an entirely different sort of coexistence. I dream of a Church that endures conflicts, resolving them differently than is done in the world, and in which no one can use the question of the correct interpretation of the gospel to personally get one's way. I dream of a Church that understands its sacramentality, the victorious presence of the grace of God in it, as the liberating freedom to pray every day with regard to persons and with regard to structures, forgive us our sins. I dream of a Church that knows its true worth, that therefore makes clear in both doctrine and life that it itself is not the heavenly Jerusalem, but is destined to disappear when the kingdom of God comes, that it is here now only to prepare the way for the earthly church and to point the way to community with God and with one another. 45 years, when he was writing after the Council, awakening out of such a dream is always difficult and getting more difficult. But without dreams, no models, and without models, no way into the third epoch of the history of the Church. Had Pesch survived beyond 2014, I think his conclusion today would be much more optimistic. And who better to lead us into an optimistic conclusion about the unfinished business of Vatican II than Massimo Faggioli. It's my great pleasure to welcome back an old friend of Georgetown's. Dr. Massimo Faggioli is, for about 6.5 more weeks, Associate Professor of Theology and Director of the Institute for Catholicism and Citizenship at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. I am delighted to announce that from summer next year, after a short sojourn back home in Italy, Massimo will be undergoing an Augustinian conversion. He has agreed to take up a professorship at Villanova University and will be moving to Philadelphia where the weather and the Italian food will no doubt be considerably better than in Minnesota. No offence to Midwesterners here. Previously, Professor Fagioli worked in the John XXIII Foundation for Religious Studies in Bologna, Italy, and received his PhD from the University of Turin, also in Italy. He moved to the US in 2008, where he was initially visiting fellow at the Jesuit Institute at Boston College between 2008 and 2009. He moved to Minneapolis with his wife, and they now have 2 children there, and he writes regularly for Italian and American newspapers and journals on the church, religion, and politics. He has a bi-weekly column in the Global Pulse online magazine and blogs for .commonweal also. His several books and articles have been published in 7 different languages. Among his award-winning publications, the most recent include, in English, the books Vatican II, The Battlefield Meaning, 2012, True Reform, Liturgy and Ecclesiology in Sacrosanctum Concilium, Liturgical Press, 2012, Sorting Out Catholicism, A Brief History of the New Ecclesial Movement, 2014, A Council for the Global Church, Receiving Vatican II in History, Fortress, 2015, and the edited collection with Andrea Vicini, The Legacy of Vatican II. Who better to lead us in our final deliberations? Please join me in welcoming and congratulating on his new position, Massimo Fagioli. Good luck.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Georgetown is really very important to me because, as I say always, Georgetown was the first destination of my first trip to the United States in 2004. I was invited here by Ladislas Orsi, and then John O'Malley is a great help always, and I have many friends here, John and Gerard, and many others. So it's a great honor. I'm going to think about my conversion later. I hadn't thought about that, but okay. So I have divided my remarks in 2 parts. The first part is a brief description of the theology of the Second Vatican Council in its solidity. What is very solid, what are the major accomplishments in a transversal way. The second part will be an assessment of what are the challenges for the future of the Second Vatican Council and the possible future prospects in light of what is happening with the pontificate of Pope Francis. Looking at Vatican II and the validity of its message for the Church of today means looking at the history not only of the Council itself, but also of its reception and interpretation in these last 50 years. The texts of Vatican II live within the fertile ground of theological and pastoral reflection on those very texts. Those texts need reception, and reception of the Council needs time. And that is why we're still talking about Vatican II. But how to talk about it? An ever-present temptation of the scholars of Vatican II is to play the guardians of the temple, especially when the generation of the bishops, theologians, and Catholics who made Vatican II is fading away. But there is a reason to continue the research on the history and the theology of the Council. The clash of narratives on Vatican II cannot transport an intellectual disputation between theologians animated by pastoral concerns to a pundit-dominated stage, where sound bites and catchphrases are the substitute for a real concern for the issues surrounding knowing, understanding, interpreting, and receiving the Council. The clash of narratives on Vatican II that tends to identify Vatican II with the 60s has somehow pushed the Council itself into the background. But in fact, there is a vision of Vatican II that goes way beyond the disputation about the narratives of the Council. Our view of Vatican II cannot be distracted by the ongoing clash, especially when we know that between the various narratives and the serious work of research done on Vatican II, there is a gap that makes the different positions often unable to understand each other. But what remains is the vision of Vatican II, a vision that is complex as the analysis of the corpus of the final documents and of the event of the Council. The effort to form a vision becomes helpless when it is detached from an understanding of the historical developments of these texts and of the events. So here I would like to offer a few insights based on an intertextual and intratextual interpretation of the documents in light of the history of the event of the Second Vatican Council. There is a first dimension that we can call vertical and horizontal. German-French Jesuit Christoph Theobald has described the documents of Vatican II as bidirectional, having a vertical axis and a horizontal axis that fundamentally represents the overall vision of the Council. The vertical axis of all the major documents of Vatican II represents the spiritual dimension, and the horizontal axis is the social dimension. But some of the final documents have a function of expanding the global message of the Council in one direction or the other. The key documents building the vertical axis are the Constitution on Divine Revelation Dei Verbum, the Pastoral Constitution Gaudium et Spes, the Declaration on Religious Freedom Dignitatis Humanae. Thanks to these three documents, says Theobald, the Church can once again, quote, have access to the source, end quote. That is, the revelation in God's Word. In this sense, the vision of Vatican II is essentially ressourcement, the quest for a new access to the same source, but after a hermeneutical reframing of Catholic theology in light of a church in transition from its European and Western paradigm toward the paradigm of a world or global Catholicism after the first transition from Christianity as a Jewish religion to a Hellenistic Mediterranean religion in the first centuries. The vertical axis of the vision of Vatican II cannot survive without a deep understanding of the new cultural geography of Catholicism. Vatican II, the first global ecumenical council, truly global, assumes this new paradigm starting from the very identity of its participants. The vertical axis means a new emphasis away from revelation as instruction toward revelation as communication, the involvement of all the church members in bringing the scripture into the life of the church, and a necessary role of reception also for the paradoxes, for the transmission of the scripture. The same vertical axis means for the relationship between church and world an acute awareness of the signs of the times and the need for the church and every Christian to discern and make a decision, thus calling every Christian to the need to look at the world he or she lives in and to seek truth as the reason for the right to religious freedom in the light of the revelation. The second dimension is the horizontal axis built by the Council documents. The ecclesiology of Vatican II after the era of apologetics and of hierarchical idolatry, or as Yves Congar called it, hierarchology, that is Lumen Gentium, the pastoral and missionary dimension of the Church, Gaudium et Spes and Ad Gentes, its ecumenical and interreligious dimensions, Unitatis et Integratio and Nostra Aetate, and the liturgy according to Sacrosanctum Concilium as the center of Christian life and of the Church in its local realization. Communication with God is nothing if it's not reflected in a human way of communicating and relating horizontally. The two ecclesiological constitutions and Nostra Aetate give theological expression to this horizontal orientation: ecumenism, interreligious relations, the Old Testament and the relations with the Jews, atheism, and modern culture. Then there is a second axis. So the first axis is vertical, horizontal. The second couple is ressourcement and rapprochement. Crossing the paths of the different council documents, we can identify another couple of ideas that are crucial and common to the message of Vatican II. First, ressourcement is at the heart of the constitutions on revelation and on the liturgy especially. This idea drives Catholic theology to the rediscovery of the first source of the Christian message, Scripture, and of the early sources of an undivided Christianity, tradition with a capital T, the fathers of the Church, and liturgy. Ressourcement places at the center of theology what must be at the center, and it reorganizes everything else with a compass that uses the category of historicity in theology in order to make theology free from history and at the same time more faithful to a tradition dynamically understood. The idea of development in theology thus finds itself examined in light of the development's coherence with the very sources of theology and with theology's main operating principle, that is, the pastoral character of the doctrine, the salus animarum, the salvation of souls. Along with ressourcement, the second crucial idea, I think, of the Second Vatican Council is rapprochement, reapproaching, reaching out, and especially, as John O'Malley has emphasized recently, reconciliation. The idea of rapprochement is at the core of the very idea of calling an ecumenical council after World War II with the Pope and all bishops who had gone through World War I and World War II. The watershed of the two world wars called church leaders and theologians very early on to make a shift towards a theology and a church that could contribute to the idea of a fundamental unity of humankind. One of the main aims of the council announced by Pope John was to summon the church and celebrate its unity in a new relationship of unity with the world. But Vatican II was meant to be a celebration also in the most profound liturgical sense. Vatican II is a liturgical celebration, also not a mere display of false unanimity, but a living experience of communion within the church and with the world through the interaction of different cultural sensibilities, historical backgrounds, and theological orientations. Vatican II continued the tradition of unity expressed through liturgy, but also through an understanding of rapprochement that expressed more clearly the attempt of Vatican II to make of the Church a sacrament of reconciliation for humankind. The idea of rapprochement, a term used many times by the pioneer of ecumenism and liturgist Dom Lambert Baudouin, is not part of the corpus of Vatican II in a material way, but it belongs fully to the aims of the Second Vatican Council. Rapprochement in the theology of Vatican II means seeking a new unity among peoples, nations, and cultures, as we see in Gaudium et Spes, among different religions and faiths in Nostra Aetate, among Christian churches in the decree on ecumenism, and within the Catholic Church in Sacrosanctum Concilium and Lumen Gentium especially, and above all, rapprochement with God through a renewed understanding and a renewed practice of the faith and of the sacraments. In John O'Malley's words, if the Church of Vatican II is visible through its new style, much of its style is represented exactly by rapprochement as the style of the Church, as the end of the era of the polemical apologetics, as the only proof of Catholicity. And we remember very clearly that Pope Francis reminded that a few weeks ago, the dialogical style of the Church is essential. It's another of the unexpected comebacks of the Second Vatican Council in this time of grace. We all remember that he did that also here in Washington, D.C., in his speech to the U.S. bishops less than 2 months ago. So this is my first part, what I think remains very valid, even more now 50 years after, of the Second Vatican Council. Now, second part, the challenges and the future prospects for the Second Vatican Council. The history of the reception of Vatican II is now 50 years long, and it has gone through different periods and moments. It is probably not a coincidence that the 50-year anniversary marks clearly a new beginning for the life of the theology of the Second Vatican Council. And as we know, this new beginning has to do a lot with Pope Francis. Now, Pope Francis clearly inaugurated a new phase in the reception of Vatican II. He doesn't say that, but it's clear. And not only for the sudden and complete disappearance of the traditionalist anti-Vatican II issues from the agenda of the papacy. Now, we know Pope Francis was ordained priest in 1969, so he does not belong in the line of the popes involved in Vatican II for biographical reasons. But there is also the specific heritage of the Catholic Church in Latin America and the legacy of Vatican II for the Latin American Church in these last 50 years. It is clear, and it is part of the future challenges, that Jorge Mario Bergoglio perceives Vatican II as a matter that should not be reinterpreted or restricted, but implemented and expanded. We can recall here just the two major issues of collegiality and synodality, because they will be key for the other developments. But the list of issues should be much longer, because for Francis, the Church of Vatican II is not just about what Vatican II discussed and was not implemented, but it is also about Vatican II, about what Vatican II did not discuss 50 years ago. So here, I think there are two elements that are typical of Francis' relationship with Vatican II and his way of implementing it. The first element is related to the facts that Francis' approach to Vatican II is exactly the opposite of a memorialization of Vatican II. What's interesting to see is that Francis mentions Vatican II quite rarely, very prudently, very appropriately, without indulging in any Vatican II nominalism, labeling Vatican II a lot of things. Francis' approach to Vatican II is not even about repairing what supposedly went wrong at Vatican II or in the post-Vatican II period, nor it's about adding directly what was ignored or forgotten or dismissed. It's about the method of Vatican II as a method for the Church of today. Francis made clear that the theological manner of proceeding of the Council, attention to history, value of experience, inductive method, the pastorality of doctrine, this manner of proceeding of the Council cannot be abandoned. We know that on the plane of the lived faith, Catholics worldwide live Vatican II every day, most of the times unconsciously. Now, he's celebrating the Council 50 years after its closure implies the possibility of becoming more conscious, finally, of the theological praxis of the Catholic Church and also of the questions that were left unresolved by the Council, and await a response, first of all, in methodological terms. The second element that I think is key to understand Francis' relationship with Vatican II is that Francis is the first Pope of a global church in proper terms. The election of Francis is a key moment in the trajectory of the post-conciliar church towards a globalization of Catholicism, not only regarding the internationalization of its executives, but especially in terms of the ability to inculturate Catholicism into cultures other than what exists or existed within Europe, which is now largely in the minority in the demographic balance within world Christianity and worldwide Catholicism. We know that the spiritual and theological weight of the decisions made at Vatican II came from the ability to express an expansion of Catholic theology, finally also de jure, not only de facto, beyond the historical, linguistic, and cultural borders of the Mediterranean. Now, Pope Francis is now a decisive factor in this moment of the reception of Vatican II because he's inculturating something that it was not supposed to be inculturated, which is the papacy. That is the most evident thing that I think is going on. Now, a few challenges. If what I just said about Francis and Vatican II is true, that is, non-memorializing but reclaiming the method of the Second Vatican Council, and second, Vatican II and Francis as the beginning of the inculturation of the papacy, if that is true, then there are many consequences and challenges for this new beginning of the Second Vatican Council. The first challenge, I think, has to do with Vatican II in the global church and in the global world. Now, Vatican II is much more a way of doing theology than a paradigm. There's no doubt that at 50 years from Vatican II, there are statements of the council, of that council of aggiornamento, that are in deep need of an aggiornamento. So just to name two issues, the ecclesiology of the Second Vatican Council was oriented towards keeping an institutional status quo that the real conditions of the Catholic Church in many parts of the world right now cannot support. Secondly, the role of women and gender in the church. That is probably the most urgent area in need of updating, together with a more authentic and honest appreciation of human sexuality. These issues are clearly open for those who see Vatican II as a moment in the development of the Catholic tradition. But the challenge here is not, I think, to proceed to an aggiornamento of the statements without an aggiornamento of the way of doing theology in the global church. So if you have witnessed the synod just a few weeks ago, you know very well that the theological discourse is still sometimes too marked by what Karl Rahner would call the Church of Hellenism and European culture and civilization. It is not just that national theological cultures are not always open enough to a truly global understanding of the Catholic Church. We could all make a long list of very important theological books that were never translated into other languages, and it would be very important. It is more about accepting or refusing, here again using Karl Rahner's famous article, quote, the transition from one historical and theological situation into an essentially new one happened only once before in the history of Christianity, and that is now set to occur for the second time in the transition from the Christianity of Europe to an actual world religion, end quote. This is to say that the biggest challenge is to have a theology of Catholicity in globalization. For all the different theological disciplines, we need a new appreciation of what Catholicity means in globalization. That can be done, I'm very certain of that, only on the basis of the theology of the Second Vatican Council, and certainly not without it, and certainly not against the Second Vatican Council. The second challenge is about Vatican II and the post-Christendom global church in its institutional elements. In the last 50 years, we have seen a change in the way we do theology. But the church as an institution has been left largely untouched by the ecclesiology of the Second Vatican Council, and some key institutions of the global Catholic Church are still there as a legacy of European Christendom. In many areas, some changes took place immediately after Vatican II, but we made a step back towards a new centralized church. Here, the failed globalization of the institutional reform of the church is part, I think, of an unaccomplished globalization of theology. That is important because the failed reform of the institution had a very deep impact on the perception of the validity of the Second Vatican Council, of its theology. And that is why I think that is a challenge for the new beginning of the Second Vatican Council. Just to mention the most clear example, the Roman Curia, we all know that the conceptual basis of the Roman Curia is still largely non-theological, and now, at 50 years from Vatican II, a new consideration must be given to the role of theology and of ecclesiology to think the church. Does theology matter for the reform of the Curia? Is a perfunctory constitutionalization of the institution the way to make the Roman Curia less impermeable to the theology that should inform everything the church does? So here the larger issue is the role of the Second Vatican Council and of the ecclesiology for the reform of church structures, and it's clearly the dossier of this pontificate that is facing more resistance. There's no question about that, I think. Finally, I identify two possible prospects when we want to think about Vatican II in the future. Both have to do with the relationship between the church and the world. The first is about the church's relationship with the modern world. Here, Gaudium et Spes was the last document approved by Vatican II, and it is the epitome of the Second Vatican Council, also because the idea of having a document like Gaudium et Spes was not part of the preparation of the Council. It emerged during Vatican II. In these last 50 years, Catholic theology has been renovated by Gaudium et Spes, and also the pontificates of the post-Vatican II period can be seen also as vast commentaries over the meaning and the relevance of the pastoral constitution in the church of today. And a very interesting research would be to compare the use of Gaudium et Spes in Paul VI, John Paul II, Benedict, and Francis. We would see incredible differences, just in terms of numbers. Here, directly or indirectly, consciously or unconsciously, Gaudium et Spes, I think, Gaudium et Spes is still the debate of today on the signs of the time of today. If we just look at the role of Gaudium et Spes during the Synod of 2014 and 2015, in the documents and in the debates, it's clear that the role of Gaudium et Spes is crucial, and the understanding of its legacy is problematic among many pastors that are inclined to see historicity and openness to the world as in contradiction with what they perceive our times require of Christians. Now, in my opinion, for a church of the future, there is no alternative to a honest but also full reappropriation of Gaudium et Spes, not as a paradigmatic text, but as a model for the development of theological thinking. Very briefly, the future of Vatican II, I think, cannot be separated from the future of Gaudium et Spes. They largely coincide. Second and final prospect is about Vatican II and the history of the Catholic tradition in the global perspective, or the relationship between Vatican II and the post-Vatican II period in world Catholicism. On the one hand, the issue is of the relationship between the tradition and Vatican II. So here, Vatican II in the tradition, like Trent and Vatican I, and the tradition like as a living body. The future of the Second Vatican Council must rely on a church that is not afraid of the historical dimension of its tradition. Again, another example from the synod that just ended in Rome. We have read of many interventions that were completely non-historical in talking about marriage as if we had a theology of marriage for 20 centuries. We all know that's not true. So it is here about recovering the Catholicity of the idea of development. And here we all know that the battle for meaning of John Henry Newman is telling of the highly disputed understanding of what development is. So there are very different ideas out there about what development is. So here it is not enough to dismantle what I would call the mantra of continuity versus rupture. So we have to do that, but it is imperative to discover in the church as a whole the Catholicity of change as one of the ways to carry on the message of the council. But that is the smaller challenge. The bigger challenge is another. Now, my impression is this, is that the current state of the debate in the Catholic Church about Vatican II is not about its theology. There is no viable Catholic theology today that is alternative to the major accomplishments and the intuitions of the Second Vatican Council. Those major accomplishments in terms of ecclesiology, theology of revelation, liturgy, ecumenism, religious liberty, I think they do not face significant challenges in the sense of going back to the pre-Vatican II period or taking a radically different route for the future of Catholic theology. My impression is that the current state of the debate in the Catholic Church on Vatican II is not even about the history of the Second Vatican Council, what happened, as it was typical of the 1990s and of the early 2000s. I mean, John O'Malley's book solved the issue forever, I think. We all know that there is a standard history of the Second Vatican Council. If you want a master narrative that is based on historiographical work done for 30 years in many countries, many different scholars in different languages. So there are variations on the theme of the Second Vatican Council as an event of change and tradition, but there is no counter-history of the Second Vatican Council unless you want to read books that are clearly coming from the world of the conspiracy mindset. Now, what is the real challenge, in my opinion, is that the real debate indirectly in coded language, but the real debate is about the relationship between Vatican II and the post-Vatican II Church. In this sense, what happens to Vatican II will depend in the next future on the answers to the question what happened in the post-Vatican II period, much more than on questions related to the theology of the Second Vatican Council. In a church where all Catholics are, whether they like it or not, Vatican II Catholics, the tensions are not theological, but they are cultural, or if we want, they are a continuation of the debate over the last document approved by Vatican II, Gaudium et Spes. For those who work in the church, for the church, in different level positions, as scholars of Catholic theology, I think the challenge is to deepen our understanding of the post-Vatican II period from a global perspective. Why? Because the narrative that has poisoned the understanding of the Second Vatican Council is a narrative on the weakening of Catholicism after Vatican II, but it is a narrative that depends entirely on a social political narrative that is embedded in a very small quarter of world Catholicism, which is the northern Atlantic hemisphere, that is very different from what happened in the post-Vatican II in the rest of the world. Now, on the other hand, for all its national and linguistic idiosyncratic instinct I talked about a few minutes ago, here Catholic theology is still much more globalized than Catholic historiography and church history. Now, the issue of Vatican II for me as an historian is also an historiographical issue because the lack of a globalization in the historiography of Catholicism in these last 50 years has also deep theological and ecclesial consequences. Finally, a globalization of the discourse on contemporary Catholicism could certainly make less parochial the controversies over Vatican II and give back to world Catholicism something like Vatican II that is part of a new global Catholic tradition. Any approach to the Second Vatican Council and the post-Vatican II, any approach that is less comprehensive than global, is destined to give us a distorted picture of what Vatican II was, what it can be, and what it will be. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Massimo. So now we are going to move to discussion time. And to begin with, our four keynote speakers will come up to give their reflections on Massimo's talk and also to answer that conundrum, thinking about one of the documents that we've been discussing these past 2 days. Were it being drafted today, what would be one key difference from the text that was drafted 50 years ago? So Father Scanoni is going to be our first respondent and offer his reflections as well.
Bueno, agradezco a Máximo, realmente excelente, y yo creo que fue el broche de oro de todos estos días, de estos 2 días, porque ha retomado, sin haber estado aquí, ha retomado muchas de las cosas que ya se han dicho y ha llevado a una conclusión muy grande. Yo no voy a responder a esa.
Well, wants to thank, obviously, Massimo for an excellent talk. That was not only the golden kind of culmination, conclusion of the 2 days, but has taken over, or actually, once again, retaken the key issues that we've discussed in the last 2 days.
No voy a responder a la pregunta de cómo serían ahora el texto, sino quiero señalar
He's
dos
not going
puntos.
to respond to the question how the text will be different today. Gerard's question, he's not going to fall into temptation.
quería retomar dos puntos que me parecen importantes.
Again, 2 points that he wants to once again reconsider.
Primero, lo que decía Máximo, que estamos y debemos estar en una iglesia global en una época de la globalización.
The first point that we are and we should be in a global church in a period, in an age of globalization.
Bueno, yo quiero añadir algo, totalmente de acuerdo, es una novedad, pero quiero añadir algo. Yo creo que para vivir una iglesia global en un tiempo global hay que mirar las cosas, como dice el Papa, no desde el centro, sino desde las periferias.
In order to really, I mean, only going to add something, agreeing with what has been said, but really, if we are going to live the life of a global church in a global time, in a global age, then we can only do it by living from the experience of the peripheries, not from the center.
Especialmente de los pobres y de los pueblos pobres.
Particularly from the poor, the experience of the poor and of poor poor countries.
Y lo segundo, totalmente de acuerdo, la importancia actual del método. Yo hablé del cambio de paradigma y del cambio de método en Gaudium Spes. El método de Gaudium Spes.
And how the most important point, which I agree, is the relevance of the method of Gaudium et Spes as the key.
Y bueno, yo creo que la lectura, el discernimiento de los signos de los tiempos, que el Papa, por otro lado, trata de ir haciendo, es sumamente importante, no solo para la teología, sino para toda la pastoral de la Iglesia.
The reading or the discernment of the signs of the times that the Pope is proposing is central, not only for the theology that we do, but for all the pastoral practice of the Church.
Que el discernimiento es un carisma ignaciano.
And of course, discernment is an Ignatian charism. We have
No solo,
this is the secret, the Jesuit
no,
Pope.
no solo ignaciano, pero también especialmente ignaciano.
Yes.
Y para terminar, yo creo que el Papa en persona es un signo de los tiempos en persona, ¿no?
And the Pope himself, in his own person, is a sign of the times.
Gracias, Máximo.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Father Scanoni. So next, I'm going to invite up Professor Linda Hogan to share her thoughts with us to close this afternoon, and then Professor Hinsey, and finally, Dr. Borelli.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Massimo, for a really wonderful and uplifting analysis, and also a challenging one and a hopeful one. I have so many notes scribbled here that I know I'm not going to be able to put any proper order on my thoughts. I suppose the first thing I do want to say, and I will follow Professor Scanone's refusal of the questions. The permission has been given. But I suppose I really do want to say that most of the documents, were they written today, could not have been written in the language and with the very Eurocentric mindset. So I do think that really the experience of living this globalized church for the last 5 decades has really transformed really our understanding of church and what it means to be church. But I do think that one of the key challenges and the key differences that one might want to think about is not only about the participation of women in the church, but also about the gendered categories and assumptions that were really embedded in the theology of Vatican II, in terms of the way of doing theology, and also in terms of, as I said, the categories. Now, it does strike me that a lot of our discussions about women in the church and feminist perspectives on church can also fall into the same trap in a way that many of the categories of the Second Vatican Council fell into, which is taking a very Eurocentric or Northern Hemisphere perspective. And what one can see in the last number of decades is it's women theologians and theologians in the global South who really have transformed our theology and who really have pushed the barriers. They have not assumed that the personal and the political are two separate spheres. In fact, they've insisted that the personal and political are intimately connected and intertwined. They have recognized that the economic and social and historical contexts in which they live deeply inform their experience of church, and they write that through their theology. And so when I think of the dynamism and the future of the church, I do think of, and the future of the intellectual leadership in the church, I do think of the women theologians in Africa, in Asia, and all over Latin and South America who are really taking up the baton of Vatican II, using the method, interpreting the signs of the times through their language, in their churches and in their contexts. And so I actually do believe that the church in its complexity looks very different today because of that, when one looks at it from that vantage point. So I think that had any of the key documents been composed today, they would have to take account of that sign of the times. And I think that they would look very different in many different ways. And so really I look forward to what will come out of the next 50 years, because I do think that our theology will look very different when we hear these voices magnified, not only because of their inclusion in the global church, but also if and when theologians and institutions like this in the Northern Hemisphere take I suppose the responsibility we have to ensure that we are able to give the platforms and the context in which their voices can be heard, their works can be published, their perspectives can inform the theologies that we teach and that the church embodies. So those are just my initial reflections. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. So now, Professor Firahinzi.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fagioli, and my entire family congratulates you on your new job. I can't add much more in my thoughts to what Professor Hogan just said. I immediately thought of how it would be different today. I wasn't shrinking from the task at all, and if they were written today. And what popped into my mind was first of all, women, which you mentioned. Second of all, Francis's love for and talking to grassroots and popular movements, and imagining if we were going to do the Gaudium et Spes process today, how those two constituencies might have made a difference. Years ago, I was in my local women's commission when the U.S. bishops wrote or tried to write the letter on women, over 3 drafts, you may recall. Yeah. And there was efforts to listen to women, and then there was a first draft that had a whole bunch of quotes from women, and people in my women's commission said, this falls flat. And then it got rewritten, and the women's voices were taken out because they seemed inauthentic. That fell flat. Eventually, they gave up. And I bring this up because what's painful about the Catholic Church, and if we imagine redoing GS today, is no longer can an all-male community and an all-European community, as you've been saying, speak for the women and speak for the church. So bringing my two thoughts together, we would need to have listening sessions and input sessions from women, but women in conjunction with the grassroots communities of the poor around the world. In other words, not just European, not just theologians, not just highly trained women, but the everyday women and men who make up the majority of the world, and find a real way to incorporate their voices, their perspectives, and so forth, because that seems to be the seed of John the 23rd's point and Francis's point of being a poor church for the poor. Who teaches? Who teaches through these documents, and who is being taught, and sort of, and finding a way to let ourselves, as the more powerful, traditional, affluent communities, be taught by and shaped by, informed by the real church of the poor. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine. Now, John Borelli.
Thank you very much. Massimo, is a terrific talk, and I come away whenever you speak or reading one of your books with these enculturation of the papacy, something that was never supposed to happen, you know. And then this last point you make, that the real future now is the battle of historicity between Vatican II and the post-Vatican II narrative, which we saw very much in the Synod battle unfold. You know, and I came on board at the Bishops' Conference between the writing of the great pastoral letters and the failure of the women's pastoral. And I remember that day when it failed. And my very bright boss, Jack Hodgkin, said, I wonder if the conference is capable of writing a pastoral letter again. We did statements, we did Middle East statements, and people came together, but there was a certain schizophrenia here. I experienced it, you know, I grew up in Oklahoma where we had a very lively liturgical reform already going on, and the further I moved east, to St. Louis to college and to New York for graduate school, there was less and less liturgical reform. In some parishes in New York, you wondered if the council had actually happened. And that schizophrenia carried over into the Bishops' Conference, because those of us working, I used to say I'm an ecumenist. In my church, that means I'm a stand-up comedian, because take my church, please. Because we were always kind of, oh yeah, I did that. It's something you do, but it's not something that penetrates the life of the church and into religious relations. And so, yes, and we gradually lost our voices. But when strong voices were there, certainly the social justice themes got heard, and the conference was very strong on those, and they could issue very good statements. But we were weakened, I think, in some other ways. But there's something else you mentioned, and that was under rapprochement, the influence of Dom Lambert Baudouin, who was one of these early friends of Roncalli. In fact, Roncalli was sent to Bulgaria because he was suspected of being a modernist, and he was sent to the diplomatic corps. But before he went, he asked Baudouin for one of his monks. I'm going to an Orthodox land. You have this monastery that is built on the principle of reaching out ecumenically and liturgically to the East. I want one of your monks. Baudouin was exiled because he came up with the expression from the Malines conversations in the 20s, Anglican Church united but not absorbed. And when Cardinal Mercier died, he had no protector, and he was sent into exile. They were reunited in Paris in 1944-45 when Roncalli was then sent. He wondered why he got Paris, and he stopped in Rome on the way. I can't imagine myself being a papal nuncio in Paris. And they said, we can't either. But the one more qualified didn't want to do it. So, and Baudouin says, I made my way to the nunciature thinking, will he remember me? Lambert, my friend, get up here. Give me a hug, you know. In 1979, Paulus Press published a history, a biography by, I forget her name, on Baudouin. And Stransky writes in the introduction, and when they were in Paris, they fantasized together about calling a council. So I said, Tom, how do you know? I don't know. Well, where'd you get that from? Well, I don't know, but I saw it confirmed. Where? In that 2-volume biography of Baudouin published by Lavin. So we got it. Marquette University Press was the only place that had it. We got it, we read it, it went in there. What was in there were testimonies of the monks. In August 1958, he was told, he was retired and not well, Holy Father is ill. Yes, he said, it'll be a short illness, there'll be a conclave, Roncalli will be elected, and he'll call a council. That's why he said one or two of his closest friends and Tardini were the only ones not surprised by the announcement. And he repeated it again. And then Stransky realized, you know, all the bishops from Belgium, that's all they talked about, was Baudouin, one of the ghosts of Vatican II, and how he influenced John the 23rd. I can't imagine Nostra Aetate or something like it not having been written by 70 years after the Shoah. So let's say John the 23rd fulfilled the hopes of the conservatives and was a caretaker. And let's say there was another Italian and the liberals won, but it would have been a cautious Montini. And let's say one or two down the line, a Pole was elected. I think Wojtyla would have written an encyclical on Judaism because of his experience. I think he would have seen the need. So then we would be dealing with the fragmented text. You know, Pius XI wanted to write an encyclical on racism and got the Jesuit John Lafarge, and it all failed. And in many ways, we're very fortunate it failed because it would have condemned anti-Semitism, but it would have embedded the anti-Jewish theology in an encyclical that was rampant in the church. Bea himself really wasn't against fragmentation. You know, it'd be stronger in Lumen Gentium if we put the piece even just on Jews. And in the third Relatio, November of '64, he's presenting it as if his behind-the-scenes agreement with Ottaviani and Ciccognani, which is in the Acta, that some way this text would be appended to Lumen Gentium. He still believed it. Meanwhile, the bishops of the Secretariat did a Relatio with the Modi, which contradicted him. This text is so important, it has its own message, it has its own integrity, it should not be appended to any text. So you had a double narrative going on. But I think, where would we be in interreligious relations? As I said in my talk, in Rome, you could find positive courses on Islam. You couldn't find positive courses on modern contemporary Judaism. Nowadays, you find positive courses on Judaism at the Gregorian, but now you see negative courses on Islam and Asian religions in a new institute. They're negative courses. The Pontifical Institute for Arabic and Islamic Studies is there, and they're teaching, but they're kind of marginalized. They're teaching, especially Asians and Africans. So it's difficult for me to imagine. I think we would not have had as strong a text responding directly to the fact of the Holocaust with correcting our teaching and in some way allowing the other themes to be wrapped in to broach this whole broad theme. I think there would have been those like Willebrand's, who already had his group going, the Catholic Conference for Ecumenical Questions, and we would have certain aficionados of ecumenism and Jewish relations and interreligious relations in the church, but they would have been marginalized groups, and maybe we would just, nowadays, without these texts, be just as schizophrenic as we are now. So who knows? But thank you again for your talk.
Well, thank you very much, John. So now we have ample time to hand over to you for your questions and reflections. Please limit yourselves to one question. No manifestos on a Friday afternoon, please. We've had some wonderful papers already today. We don't have time for any more. I don't know if we have a roving mic. Do we, John? There is a roving mic. So if you put your hand up, and also if your question is addressed to anybody specifically, please say that. And when you stand up, please introduce yourself as well. So, David.
David Hollenbach. I'd just like to say a comment on what Massimo Fagioli said about the challenge of the relation of the Vatican II Church to the post-Vatican II period, or the interpretation there. And then one thing, this is a result of the work that I've been doing personally of the last few years, about a sign of the times that is operative today in relation to the global church. And it is the reality of vast numbers of displaced people and refugees in the world. We have the largest number of displaced people in the world today, over almost 60 million people, than has ever been recorded before, even around the time of the Second World War. But if you look at globalization, I have a phrase that I thought of using for an article I was going to write called globalization, the view from a refugee camp. I mean, normally we think of globalization looked at from the top of a Wall Street large corporation, but movement of people across borders and so forth in light of this refugee and displaced people phenomenon is something that is an urgent reality of our times. And to be honest, I don't think the world and the politics of our has a clue about how to deal with it. Nobody knows what to do about Syria. Nobody knows what to do about all the displaced in Africa. And so how do we respond? This, I think, the church is one of the few institutions around the world that really interacts with people in all these different places. So maybe this is a post-Gaudium et Spes sign of the times that needs some real response, and perhaps it's a challenge that the church really needs to grapple with, not just from a immediate ethical and political point of view, but theologically, because it calls into question the reality of the nation state. If we raise questions about the reality of nation states, we're talking about a really fundamental reorganization of the world. Anyway, it's just an adding on to what you were already saying.
Yeah. Massimo, do you want to come up here for the sake of the camera? Right.
Thanks very much, David. Just two things. First, so one of the updates that we need to do looking at Vatican II is this nation-state approach of the Second. I mean, John was talking about Belgium. I mean, Belgium has not been a nation-state in these last 10 years, more or less. It is a bureaucratic state, which is so we need to move. So we have moved from the imperial church, I mean church empire, and the nation state. Now what? Now, my optimism is based on the fact that now those in the church who makes decision, they now, with Pope Francis, they are listening, or they are invited to listen to those who are in refugee camps, or who know about refugee camps, who think that have the feeling of reality. That is something that wasn't happening for quite some time. That is actually the best possible thing that could happen in a short period of time.
Wonderful, thank you. As a footnote, I think one of the most moving things during Pope Francis's visit to the United States was when he addressed both houses of Congress and said, "We are all migrants here." For the first time, we have a Pope who really has lived the experience. His father was a migrant, his mother was the child of migrants, and he's made it a priority. One of his first visits, of course, on being made Pope, was to the refugee island in southern Italy of Lampedusa. So I think this is an issue that the Church is going to focus on more and more, thankfully. Okay, so we've got it over there. Yep.
Cardinal John Henry Newman once said that before a given council could be totally appreciated or understood, we need another council. Do you think there's a chance for another council? Or do you think, yes, or do you think that the present mode of synods and regional conferences are enough for our world today?
I don't know if we can sustain synods after what we have seen in the last. So no, I don't think Vatican III is around the corner. Pope Francis has said once in one of the many interviews, I said, we are still digesting Vatican II. I think that's wise. So I am in favor of very frequent synods, local synods. What's happening in Italy this week, the National Ecclesial Conference, that has changed significantly from the previous experience of the last of the previous 40 years. And so there is a national synod going on in Italy, which was a taboo. Until 2 years ago, nobody dared to speak. Pope Francis told them, you have to have a national synod. So there are other ways, other than a global ecumenical general council, I think.
John?
Sure. And that's, I know when I was in graduate school in the late 60s, when professors would say, you know, it takes 100 years to receive a council, I get so angry. You mean in my lifetime? What do you mean? You know, you're putting me down. And Jeff Groh and I once tried to find out who said that. I don't think anybody ever said it originally. It just sort of emerged. But under Benedict, I began to see the wisdom of it. And Cardinal Cosper's approach would be, we've accomplished so much in the post-Vatican II period in ecumenism, but we have to digest it. The future is really, we're still digesting what it means. And I think if Les Orsi was here to give this talk, he would say, we need a change of generation of those who have no memory of the council or the reception of the council, for the true reception. That's the point he's making.
Thanks, John. Theologians salivate at the thought of another Vatican Council, but I think Massimo's right, and Pope Francis, the week before the synod closed, gave us a hint of the future, that he called the church to become a truly synodal church. And I think there will be many more local synods and processes picking up the baton from what was experimented with in the 80s, but was swiftly put a stop to by the 1990s. Okay, so next question. Okay, there's a hand here.
Does Pope Francis have a successor?
You can answer that.
I'd say Pietro Parolin is being prepared as we speak.
Not Tagley. No.
Well, Tagley next but one, probably. We don't want another pope for 40 years, you know. It's.
I have a question.
Yep.
I'll take the microphone. Since there are several here who could probably answer it. We hear often the narrative that market economy has brought the largest number of people out of absolute poverty, and they pat themselves on the back. And then people say, well, yeah, China and India, this is largely true. But isn't it true that there are more people living in poverty as such, and that more and more people slip into poverty from the middle class? I mean, it seems like that there are competing statistics here on this, and I figure some of you who work with Gaudium et Spes could probably answer this.
John, I think I can speak to India, where you have a middle class of 200 million, and a lower class of far distant from that middle class of 1 billion. So the divides are really large, and so an absolute poverty is defined so absurdly low as $1 a day, that it seems to me we really have to look seriously at that. China has really done amazing things, but there are enormous gaps in China and enormous problems being suffered because of the way they went ahead. Poisoning of the water, poisoning of the air, poisoning of the soil, and so on.
Any further comments to John? Jose?
It's a comment about the globalization of Catholicity, what does it imply? We as Finnish, David was part of the project on the Jesuits and globalization. And what is amazing about reflecting upon their project of globalization of the 16th, 17th century, because they were really the pioneer globalizers. They are the first one to think and to act globally, and the first ones to connect North and South and East and West in a fascinating way. They were defeated. They were defeated. They were thrown out of every country. They were thrown out of every Catholic kingdom. They were suppressed by the Pope. because they had a project of globalization that was neither that of the Catholic kings nor that of Romanization. It was one of enculturation. The model was, well, Christianity became Hellenic, became Latin, and it was radically transforming the process. It has to become Japanese, it has to become Chinese, it has to become, even in Latin America, that it was not, it was through colonization. The Council of Lima was published, the documents in Latin, but was immediately translated into Quechua, Aymara, and Spanish. And the idea is to become a Christian, you don't have to become Hispanized. You don't have to become Europeanized to become a Christian in Japan. And this became impossible in the 19th century. We had a model of Romanization throughout the 19th century. Catholicism became Romanized, globally Romanized in the 19th and 20th century. And how to now reopen a process of a plural global Catholic churches. This is really, really what Catholicity implies, and only then we can truly become. So this is the real issue of Catholicity, which is not Romanization. This is the real issue.
Okay, is that a hand at the back? Yeah, and then I've seen another hand there, so we'll go. So right at the back, and then...
A comment on the, John Carr here at Georgetown, the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life. Comment on the economics and then a question. You can have several things going on at once in that there can be people leaving absolute poverty globally, and poverty in this country can be increasing. And in fact, some people who live formally above the poverty line, but whose lives are becoming a matter of despair. We have this amazing study, it's been commented on, where life expectancy for African Americans and Hispanics have always trailed whites, but it's always been, at least for a while, it's been getting better. We now have a study that says for middle-aged, lower-income white people, white men and women, life expectancy is actually going down because of lack of work, suicide, addiction. So while the numbers can be moving this way and that, the dignity, the lives of people are at risk. It seems to me as an amateur that in some ways Vatican II pulled in and consolidated and advanced the theological work that had been going on for a long time. It seems to me that what Pope Francis has done in some ways has jumped ahead of the debate, over the debate about Vatican II, a church of and for the poor, the mercy of God, the joy of the gospel. And is part of the task now, frankly, for theology to catch up with that and explain what it means to be a church of and for the poor. Explain what the mercy of God means. The other thing that troubles me deeply, and I admire Pope Francis enormously, but I think the decision to call a synod on the family may have been a mistake because it frankly brings out the worst in us, particularly North Americans and Europeans. Before the synod, we actually talked about the poor for a year. And now we've had a couple of years of only talking about divorce and homosexuality and contraception and abortion. The obsession that Pope Francis warned us about in focusing on a few issues is not only shared by the church, it's shared by the media, and it's shared by some theologians and some of the rest of us in the church. My hope is that while Vatican II dealt with an entire range of issues, our church will get back to talking about a much broader range of issues. And I think Pope Francis in some ways has jumped over the debate about the council and its reception to give us a new agenda. And I wonder what other people think. How do we get beyond the obsessions?
Matthew, you got a comment? Yeah.
I had my fair share of obsessions in these last 2 weeks, as you may have heard. But so I think that the big issue is not much behind or beyond Francis, is that for the biggest problem we had, I think, was that the magisterium and theologians and the people of God, they were living in separate worlds. And so theologians have talked for decades on poverty, on popes have also but in their sphere, in their world, and their lay Catholic. So what's going on right now? So a quick definition of the Francis papacy may be restore sanity in the Catholic Church, but it is about restoring normal, healthy conditions of coexistence, different levels, different languages, different tasks. That's what's going on. I think Pope Francis is doing a lot of things that we will have to account for. I mean, to do theology about that. But that's typical of the papacy. I mean, John Paul, what he did for Judaism, he didn't write much about that. So it's a similar problem. So what is typical of this pontificate is that finally Francis has acknowledged that there was this huge miscommunication, gap, broken bridges, and the synod was a small attempt to do that. So those very violent comments sometimes is not that different from the third session of the Second Vatican Council and fourth session when we were discussing Nostra Aetate, and you had some bishops, the bishop of my diocese in Italy, handing anti-Jewish leaflets in St. Peter. So we got better, actually, right now. So the synod, I think, was a painful but necessary moment. That's my conviction, I would say.
Thank you, Massimo. I think the synod proved one thing, that the world doesn't come to an end if bishops disagree, and for that reason alone it was valuable. But so there was a lady with a question right at the back.
My name is Hu Yeping, coming from Center Study for Values from Catholic University and the Culture for Council for Research in Values and for Philosophy. I'm from China, Chinese. And just now, Professor Jose Casanova talking about the cultural reason and also about the globalization. I want to give an example. Last July, we had a meeting, the Council for Research in Values and Philosophy had a meeting with the Wuhan University in China. The topic was the method of Matteo Ricci and dialogue of religions and cultures. And it was interesting that the two parties, we had seven visiting of scholars and kind of a dialogue with the Chinese professors on this Matteo Ricci experience. And the Chinese professors were saying, Matteo Ricci came and he misunderstood the Chinese culture, and then the foreign visitors would defend, and especially the Chinese priest who studied at the Catholic University, and he was even stronger to defend on this Matteo Ricci method. And even at the end, and the conclusion, and some professor was saying, and what's the point for Matteo Ricci to come to China? And I would say that no matter what culture, what religion you belong to or you believe in, and we come to another land as a guest, and you follow the culture, the indigenous belief, and also you bring a gift to share with the local culture, and then eventually you can emerge with the local culture, like Buddhism in China. So this is the example. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone like to respond on the Matteo Ricci method? Jose? Okay. Thank you. I think there was another question over here somewhere.
Demographics experts predict that within the next 30 years to 40 years, Europeans will not be the majority peoples in North America, particularly the United States. I'm curious to know how a European United States Catholic Council of Bishops is going to deal with a largely non-European laity.
Jose?
I mean, this is a long story. The Catholic Church in America has always first French bishop when the Irish came, and the French bishops couldn't understand the Irish, and then came. So this is an old story, of course, the disparity between the new immigrants and the bishops. But this is a fact that if immigration, the Catholic Church was basically an immigrant European church. Now it's truly a global Catholic Church. But it's happening everywhere. I'm now associated with Australia. In Australia, every parish is made up of Catholics from all over Asia. But you go to Japan, and any parish in Japan is made up not of Japanese, the majority, but immigrants from the rest of Asia. So this is simply a new phenomenon throughout the global church. It's not only here in the United States. We are really becoming a global immigrant church everywhere. And this is the great, I would say, the strength and richness of the Catholic Church.
If anything, the church is becoming more like it was in its beginnings, and I think having a pope from Latin America is a great way forward. Obviously his worldview by default is different from all of his predecessors, and that's bringing a lot of refreshing changes to the church. There was another question somewhere over here, I think, in addition to the one we just had. No? Okay, right at the back.
My name is Kevin, and the earlier reference to the Romanization of the church in the 19th century prompted me to think about another dialogue, and that is the Eastern Orthodox churches. And post-Vatican II, the introduction of Francis, the outreach about the environment, what is the role, what is the place? Is there room, or are we going to leapfrog over that kind of dialogue as we look to the periphery? Is there room left for that going forward, or is it too much of a north-north kind of conversation going forward?
Well, I staffed that dialogue for 8 years in the U.S., and it was when the Soviet Union was coming apart and Eastern Catholics were coming out of the underground, people that the Orthodox said don't exist anymore. So it is an important dialogue, and we applaud Francis for the way that he has related to Bartholomew. And almost immediately they spent some time. Bartholomew came to his installation, and that was historic, right? It's first time in history. Yeah, I think so. The only other time a patriarch was when the Pope was in Istanbul or someplace, Constantinople in those days. So, and then gave him a special role in the bringing out of Laudato Si, because Patriarch Bartholomew has a long record of teaching in this field. But he's cautious because there's such internal struggle going on in Orthodoxy right now. And that's always plagued this relationship. We've tried to reach some consensus, and then when the Soviet Union fell apart, then we were told, well, all those agreements were under duress because the Soviets were in charge and we couldn't really be ourselves, so we had to start over. And now there's a big struggle between Moscow and Constantinople on who really speaks for Orthodoxy. And in many ways, the Patriarchate of Moscow has become an imperial church, matching Putin's plans. So politics has just made this a very difficult relationship. Now on the ground, take the Middle East, take Syria, Lebanon, where we have like 3 Orthodox jurisdictions, because on the one hand, we've made great progress with the Oriental Orthodox, the Syrians and the Copts and the Armenians, and could go right ahead with all kinds of sacramental sharing and everything else, but we say we have to wait for the Orthodox to come on board with them too. But in Syria, and where we have all 3 jurisdictions, they get along very well. They're all in a kind of common experience. They would move ahead with full communion if the mother churches would allow them. In fact, there was some 15 years ago, the Melkite Church and the Antiochian Church were ready just to move ahead, and Constantinople and Rome said, no, you can't do that. So it's the politics of it that has really held up this. And yet when you ask somebody, what should we do in ecumenism, they always point to the Orthodox-Catholic relationship, which has just been plagued with difficulties. We've made more progress with Lutherans and with Anglicans than we have with Orthodox. So on the one hand, it's great to see Bartholomew playing this role. On the other hand, it's kind of sad that we can't move in any direction on this. So.
Good, thank you. Yeah, Jose.
You know, there was a plan, a synod of all the Orthodox churches in Constantinople, in Istanbul, next year. It was a plan organized by the Moscow Patriarchate, where it was to be enthroned as really the top patriarchate. But now the whole thing is up for grabs. It's not going to be in Istanbul. Now Moscow would like to have it in Greece, where they can control the situation more. But it's a very look, the fact is Ukraine has become a problem for the Moscow Patriarchate. Ukraine has more parishes of the Moscow Patriarchate than all the Russian Federation together. If they cannot control the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine, the whole project fails. So there's a very complex now situation going on between Orthodox churches that is related to precisely, and it has to do with also the project of imperial project of Russia and so on. So it's a very complex situation. Yeah.
Thank you, Jose. Any further thoughts or questions? Yeah.
Okay. We've heard some discussion, a lot of discussion, and we've lived through the various interpretations of Vatican II over the decades. We've just, on a smaller scale, been through all the publicity of the Synod. You know, you've talked about the value of the process that's been opened up, but what do you see as kind of a battle over the interpretation of the meaning of the document, or what the meaning of this Synod that we've been through on the family? Yeah.
Well, first thing, it's early to tell. So we know that Francis is going to do something. He's doing something, again, with the speech in Florence 3 days ago. He repeated and reinforced something that he said in one of the 2 key speeches he gave the Synod on synodality. That is the Magna Carta of the Synodal Church coming from Pope, but even more stunning, the speech at the end of the Synod on how to be a church that is about the gospel more than about sitting on the throne of Moses, as Pope Francis said. So we don't know. So the interpretation of the Synod is different from the interpretation of the Council. So these 2 institutions are different. Of course, one thing is this, is that until the Synod of Francis, the 2 Synods of Francis, nobody was interested in what was going on at the Synod. So from an historical perspective, they were non-objects. Nothing was going on. I mean, now we ask this question on interpretation, on what happened, on what, because they matter. We know they matter. So one easy solution would be to compare the 2 final documents, 2014, 2015, but there are many other elements that, so it's too early, but I think nobody expects that nothing will happen. In this sense, there is an inversion of the role between Vatican II and Paul VI, or Paul VI and the Commission on Humanae Vitae. So we come from an experience of the papacy that is cautious. Now we have a pope who's cautious, who's afraid of being overly cautious. That's primacy. That's what was going on. So something happened, something will happen, and that's new in the history of the synods. That's very clear to me.
Will there be a post-synodal statement?
He said not soon. He said we need some time to think about that. But I think there will be. And I'm ready for some surprises during the Jubilee. it's a great window of time, a time of grace to do something important, I think. I don't know what, but, but that's it.
Thank you, Massimo. One of the refreshing things about this synod, it was the first one since the 70s where the conclusions weren't written in advance. So, one final question. We've time for one final question. Anybody with a burning question or statement? Matt. Hang on for the mic because I don't think some people can hear you.
Okay, this is for... Okay. Matthew Shadle from Marymount. This is also for Massimo. Since we're on the subject of the Synod, one thing that stuck out to me near the end of your talk was you said a characteristic of our church today is that the battle over interpreting it is primarily a northern discussion in the weakened social context, but that the real life is in the South, Africa and Asia. But that was also one of the hermeneutics of the Synod, of a tension between a weakened, desperate northern German church and a more vibrant African church. So what's your read on that dynamic for the future?
I mean, South is Africa, but is also Latin America, which is fully behind Francis. So so there is a geopolitics of the positions of the Synod, but if we're not talking about Africa, it's clear that some of the positions of the African bishops are part of the anti-colonial sentiment, which is fully understandable. It's part of that, but so here the political element, I mean, plays in different directions. About the German church being desperately weak, I mean, any church in the world compared to the West church is desperately weak. There's no question about that. I mean, look, so they have an issue of membership and so on, but if you read the texts of linguistic circles, German theology was on a completely different level, and in the end, it made the difference. It made a difference on many levels, and they could include Cardinal Müller of the CDF, which was remarkable. So here, I'm not saying that the political issue was not the Synod. It is complicated, and the geopolitics of the Synod is one of the keys that I use, not the only one. There are Africans like Cardinal Serra, and there are Africans like Cardinal Turkson. It's very, very mixed, I think.
Okay, thank you very much, Massimo, and thank you for all your questions. We're now going to move from the reception of Vatican II to reception of an even more interactive kind, TGI Friday. So I'd like to thank Massimo once again for an enthralling talk, and all of our panelists for their contributions. And I'd like to thank all of you for attending these past 2 days. It's been a fantastic few sessions that we've had together, and it shows us a lot of hope and vitality ahead for the Church. John Borelli wants to say a few final words, but I'd also just like to say it's appropriate that we show our appreciation for the people who have organised and worked behind the scenes for this conference the past 2 days, all of the staff here, but especially Jose, Drew, and Sam Wagner, and above all, John Borelli himself. Thank you very much. John?
Yes.
The last word, of course, must be John's.
My last word. Well, no, I did want to thank Drew and Jose and Sam for bringing this, and all those who've helped us put this on, the receptions and the dinner and the support and everything. We come up with these great ideas, but Sam would look at us with a screwed-up face saying, really? You know, we're going to do that? And it's gone very smoothly. I want to thank Father Scanone, first of all, because when we got together, we say, we need a celebrity, you know, and we need somebody who's going to speak for the new consciousness that's in the Church. And so just the thrill when you responded that you were going to come and come this far, that we could put a conference then around you. And I want to thank Linda, and I want to thank Christine also for responding and coming, and then all the others. David Hollenbach, you were advising too, and you hear this, and to be a respondent, and all the others. I failed to mention all of you. Heather from Baltimore, because I wanted a young person involved in Jewish-Christian relations to be part of this too. And so, and Drew, of course, you were respondent as well. And so, thank all of you, and Peter Fan. It's this, I have a sense we needed some way to bring this Jubilee to a point, and this idea of the unfinished agenda, and get us off of historicizing about the council, as you say, but thinking about how this will go forward. And Massimo, thank you very much for this final drawing together of threads. And Massimo did this, I have a feeling some of this is pre-prepared on a week's notice, when we had word last Friday from Les Orsi that he was not going to be able to give his presentation. And I'm delighted that we have you, and the stimulation and the new terms you've given us to play with. And finally, to thank all of you for staying and participating and asking very good questions and keeping the discussion going alive between sessions. This has been a real delight. Massimo talked about, and the Jubilee will have surprises, and it will be during the Jubilee. Yes, we have a Jubilee of Mercy that begins on December 8th, representing what I think is really the second closing commencement, let's say, of the council. We had a commencement in December, and if you read Paul VI, he was tentative. He's saying, we got to take it as a whole. It's like, what have we done, all of this? But it's a whole, and we're going to interpret it, and it's going to be available to everybody. But, you know, and this one now, a Jubilee of Mercy, taking this theme of mercy and seeing it as an appropriate second conclusion or commencement of the council. It is something to look forward to. So thanks all of you. Bye-bye.